When time travel was first developed, it wasn't long before people realized that laws had to be made. All the species who had the technology agreed that it would only be used for research.
It is intriguing to research and create an in-depth analysis of time travel and the various problems it causes in the Star Trek universe. Understandably, a human-centric perspective is all we're ever going to get. Looking at this from an Eagle Eye's point of view, it all begins with the United Earth's Starfleet being little more than puppets. It moves on to the 23rd century Federation Starfleet being a temporal power that used time travel casually, to the 24th century Starfleet more forgetting about it or barely knowing of it, to the 29th century finally beginning to patrol time and keep a watchful eye, to the 30th century Starfleet actively having accords and working as a police force to prevent all-out war, to a shattered and defeated 31st century Starfleet destroying all its time travel equipment and keeping to laws they could never enforce at this point, even if they wanted to. Let's just get into it.
Where's Kling?
The humans have him.
Recover the evidence.
I will. I promise you.
The first time humanity ever actively becomes involved in things dealing with time travel is during the 22nd century Temporal Cold War. As stated before, at this time, Starfleet would be little more than a pawn or puppet of the various factions that were attempting to gain dominance as they fight each other. The United Earth would never directly be able to impact nor control any part of the Temporal Cold War. While we don't have a full scope of the temporal powers that were involved, we do know of several that existed. This includes Future Guy, a man who would claim to be a part of the 28th century and use the Suliban of the 22nd century to enact his will, the Nakul, a 29th century terrorist government that ultimately forces the Temporal Cold War into an all-out war, a race from another dimension known as the Sphere Builders, and the United Federation of Planets, Starfleet. The Temporal Cold War that I've been mentioning is defined by several proxy conflicts and internal struggles that would culminate in the 22nd century, specifically the years of 2151 to roughly 2161. It would also include the 20th century, specifically the years of 1939 to 1945. We're just going to get back to that in a bit. The main two proxy powers that would be consistently used by the various temporal powers included the Suliban Cabal and the United Earth. The United Earth would actually be forced into several conflicts due to the actions of the Suliban Cabal. The United Earth wasn't alone though. The Cabal would find itself with a myriad of enemies. This included the Suliban Renegades, a faction that realized the damage the Cabal was causing and broke off in an attempt to fight them, as well as the Tandarians, a government that was in open war with the Cabal after realizing that the Suliban had temporal abilities. While there is no evidence of any temporal powers assisting, the Tholian Assembly would make an appearance in the Cold War, trying to acquire a time ship. Though if they knew what the time ship could do, or just trying to get the vessel because they knew it was advanced, is still somewhat in the air. United Earth would be plunged into the conflict when the Suliban Cabal attempted to destabilize the Klingon Empire. Had they been successful, this would have resulted in a Klingon civil war. Luckily, these efforts would fail, and the United Earth dispatched a ship to the Empire to deliver a Klingon warrior that had been wounded who was trying to escape the Cabal. Thanks to the United Earth's Starfleet keeping him alive, the Empire would identify the attempts to destabilize their government, and the Civil War would be averted.
I work for a different kind of organization. We make sure that people like Silic don't interfere with historical events.
I've never heard of a group like that.
That's because it doesn't exist yet.
Ultimately, a person known as Time Agent Daniels would reach out to the United Earth's Starfleet officer, Captain Archer. He would do this in an attempt to persuade the man to help him capture Silic, leader of the Suliban Cabal. Curiously, this happened immediately after Silic saved the NX-01 Enterprise, so Archer would understandably be confused, though he would try to help ultimately. While it's never completely verified, Time Agent Daniels was likely a part of Starfleet and the United Federation of Planets. Both the 30th century Starfleet temporal powers and Future Guy are two subjects that I definitely need to delve into more, and I will at a later time. But suffice it to say, the Temporal Cold War is a lot more gray when you look at who's the good guy and who isn't, even if the dialogue tries to tell us differently. With Klingon Empire stability no longer an issue, minor events between the United Earth and the Suliban Cabal would still occur, the two constantly in a move-counter-move relationship. The Cabal would often try to stop the NX-01 Enterprise's voyage, outright destroy the vessel, and conversely, sometimes outright assist them. Again, this is something that needs to be discussed more in depth, but it would appear that the Cabal and the United Earth might have been more aligned than either side realized, even if they both seem to be at each other's throats. The next major event would be of a move by a temporal power known as the Sphere Builders. As stated, it's an organization from another dimension. They would convince the Xindi to attack Earth and begin the United Earth-Xindi War, or Xindi War for short. This all starts when the United Earth is devastated by a Xindi test weapon. Future Guy would tell the United Earth's Federation about the Xindi and that they were continuing to create a massive weapon in order to finish the job. The United Earth would then dispatch the NX-01 Enterprise to find the weapon and destroy it. The government would be joined by the Andorian Empire and, while it's never directly stated, likely the Vulcan High Command against the Xindi. I do include the Vulcans because we see them at the end of the Temporal Cold War sending ships to welcome back the NX-01 Enterprise. This meant that their vessels were present and available, or at least trying to get there when the Xindi weapon attacked. Oh yeah, spoilers. They also were allies of the United Earth, which was a big deal. Speaking of the Xindi War, thanks to mostly the NX-01 Enterprise, but ultimately a joint effort between the United Earth and Andorian Empire, along with a majority of the Xindi Council that would realize their mistake, the weapon is destroyed before it can get to Earth. Terra was finally safe from all-out annihilation. The last major front would be...
News on parade. America and Germany together in the fight for freedom. In his first visit to the home of the brave, the German Chancellor received a warm welcome from the Big Apple. He greeted enthusiastic crowds in Times Square and took in the view from the top of the Empire State Building. Watch that first step. Later, the Fuhrer paid a call to Lady Liberty, where he was given the keys to the city. The whirlwind tour was capped off by a 4-hour speech to city leaders where the Fuhrer outlined his vision for a prosperous alliance between Germany and America.
Okay, let's reset a second. Up to this point, the 22nd century had been the beachhead for the multiple temporal powers trying to vie for dominance. The majority of the proxy conflicts would be in this specific century. However, in a last-ditch effort to win the war, Vosk, leader of the Nakul, which were basically a race of terrorists, launched an all-out attack on the United Federation of Planets in the future, the 30th century. He would defeat Starfleet and then he would escape to 1939, where he would then ally with the Nazis and help the Nazis fight against the Allies, giving them major victories and changing the tide of the war. He would use Nazi Germany so that he could create a temporal portal to escape, but not before Germany invaded the United States. Oh my god, this is bad writing. I am almost completely sure this was an FU from the writers. The writers who started this actually wrote it after they heard they had been fired. Anyway. Desperate to stop him at all costs, the 30th Century Starfleet, or at least Temporal Agent Daniels, would pull the NX-01 out of time and order them to fight against the Nazis and Nakul as his last dying breath. Captain Archer, along with his new ally, Selik of the Suliban Cabal, would defeat Vosk and time would effectively be reset. While Time Agent Daniel would state this was the ending of the Temporal Cold War, it was more likely that this was just a calming of tensions. The Temporal Cold War would eventually become a temporal war that devastates not just the Prime timeline, but multiple universes. The 22nd century was not only a beachhead, but the beginning of time travel for the denizens of the United Earth and the Federation Starfleet. It would only be a short amount of time before we see Starfleet become a temporal power in the 23rd century. Stay tuned. Things are about to get somewhat dumb.